aircraft flown in the Persian Gulf War were some of the best money could buy. They were faster, more agile, elusive, and most of all, more lethal. A new generation of air weaponry, better equipped to defend against heavy concentrations of ground fire. While not every plane was the most sophisticated, each had a critical role to play and a decisive impact on the outcome of Operation Desert Storm. The Persian Gulf was a turning point in military history. For the first time, a massive strategic air campaign led to a decisive victory over a well-defended opponent. Part of that success can be attributed to the quick establishment of a central leadership. With coalition forces involving 31 nations, organization was essential. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf became commander of all forces, and General Charles Horner led the coalition air campaign.
117, this is a team effort. The second aircraft comes through.
The idea of having one air boss in charge of air operations in the war was new insofar as implemented in this war, but it's been around for some time. In fact, it's been fundamental to the concepts for employment of air in Southwest Asia. We've trained this way for years.
With the command in place, the first goal of the campaign was to quickly gain control of the skies. For that, no plane was better suited than the F-15 Eagle. First flown in 1972, the F-15 Eagle was a major advance in high-performance fighter aircraft, but it was only developed because the United States thought the Soviet Union had a better plane. For the F-15 was a direct response to the MiG-25 Foxbat, a fast-flying, high-altitude fighter that seemed far superior to the West stop jet, the F-4 Phantom. Years later, Western analysts discovered the Foxbat was not the stellar leap in aviation technology that it seemed to be. But in the 1960s, the threat seemed very real. So the United States Air Force called for manufacturers to design a super fighter, a plane that could outshoot and outfly anything in the sky. McDonnell Douglas won the contract with a two-engine, single-seat powerhouse incorporating every cutting-edge electronic system available. The new plane, designated F-15, was big and expensive, about $30 million per plane in today's dollars. But it was the fastest, most maneuverable fighter ever built. It was also the deadliest, for the heart of the F-15 is its APG-70 pulse Doppler radar, which can locate targets 100 miles away. This is critical. For in air combat, spotting your opponent first can make a life or death difference. When the time to fight arrives, an Eagle pilot has 4 weapons to choose from. He can fire long-range radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. He can deploy AIM-9 Sidewinders, deadly close-range weapons that lock onto hot exhaust. AIM-120 missiles, known as AMRAAMs, are medium-range weapons similar to but more powerful than AIM-7s. Lastly, the M61 cannon. The F-15 has gone through 3 major upgrades since it entered Air Force service in 1974. During the Gulf War, American pilots flew the latest fighter model, the F-15C. 120 were sent abroad. They fought alongside 82 Royal Saudi Air Force F-15Ds, essentially the same plane as the C. Saudi F-15s shot down 2 Iraqi Mirage F-1s during the Gulf War. Over the years, the F-15 has proven itself the dominant air superiority fighter in the world. The design was so successful that the Air Force decided to apply the Eagle's sturdy frame and enormous power to tactical bombing missions. The result was the F-15E, a two-man plane that combines the Eagle's speed and agility with the best bombing system tax dollars can buy. 30% of the Eagle's airframe was modified to enable it to carry heavy bomb loads. The most noticeable changes are the E's longer wingspan and conformal fuel tanks. The E is also painted a darker shade of gray to camouflage its night-flying missions. 2 squadrons of E's were to become operational in late 1991. But world events rushed the plane into service. The fighter bomber underwent a trial by fire as a key part of the largest coalition air effort since World War II. August 2, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Western and Arab leaders fear that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's next target is Saudi Arabia, and ultimately control of half the world's oil supply. August 7th, the 71st Squadron of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing leaves Langley, Virginia. Their destination, Saudi Arabia.
I still didn't believe we were going to do it until I saw the first Eagle take off from the 71st heading over. And I was number 24 out of the 24 we sent that day, and pretty surreal atmosphere to take off at 5 o'clock in the afternoon from Langley and go out and hit a night tanker. The flight over was tense, to tell you the truth, very tense.
The 14-hour flight from Langley to Saudi Arabia required each pilot to execute up to 8 mid-air refuelings. It was a fitting start to a war in which tankers played a crucial role. Over the 6 weeks of combat, tankers would pump 110 million gallons of fuel to 46,000 planes. When they arrived at Al-Kaj, American air crews found state-of-the-art airstrips, blast-proof hangars, and modern maintenance facilities waiting for them. Since 1983, the Saudis have been building emergency airfields across their country for use in case the Gulf was threatened by an aggressor. But despite this advantage, some feared that planes such as the F-15 were simply too complex to survive the pressure of a round-the-clock war.
Yeah, there was a piece of safety wire that showed up on the X-ray, so we have to...
In fact, just the opposite proved true. The number of airplanes ready to fly at any given time actually increased during the war. F-15s went from an 85% peacetime mission-capable rate to a wartime average of 94%. January 17th, 1991. In the early hours of the morning, 668 aircraft and their pilots gear up for the first air attack on Iraq and occupied Kuwait.
No doubt the first night was fairly impressive. And what was really unique about that for me was as we let down into our low level and we flew the first 250 miles or so into Iraq at low altitude and saw absolutely nothing. And you can't prepare somebody for being shot at. I thought I had been prepared for that, but it was truly an eye-opening experience.
A key element of our overall strategy was to knock down his interceptors before they could interfere with our operations. The F-15Cs performed beautifully in that role. And what it amounted to in the first 3 days of the war, when the control of the air was really contested by both sides, the Iraqis would take off, they'd put their gear up, and they'd blow up. That's because the F-15, with its look-down, shoot-down capability, was able to target them immediately after takeoff. I think that was fundamental to our success in the whole campaign.
The F-15's mission is to intercept enemy aircraft and protect friendly aircraft. In the Gulf War, that meant guarding packages of planes, including F-16s, which flew bombing raids. F-4G Wild Weasels, which knocked out anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. F-111 long-range fighter bombers, which flew over 4,000 sorties in the Gulf. British-built Tornado fighter bombers. And B-52s, the long-serving heavy bombers that shelled Iraq's Republican Guard around the clock every day of the war. Hundreds of coalition airplanes were in the sky at any one time. Airborne Warning and Control System airplanes, better known as AWACS, kept air traffic straight. Largely thanks to AWACS, there were no air-to-air friendly fire incidents during the Gulf War.
Data coming in with no symbology.
When AWACS spotted enemy planes, they sent F-15s in for the kill. The 120 U.S. and 82 Saudi F-15s were responsible for 36 of the 41 confirmed air combat victories by coalition forces.
The closest thing I saw to an enemy aircraft was the first day, and that was in our package. The F-15s got 2 MiG-29 kills. I can remember watching what the MiG-29s were doing on my radar. I just had it looking out there in the distance. And when those guys turned and committed out on us, the Eagles were waiting on them and just jumped on them and shot them both down.
Iraq's Air Force consisted of 750 fighters and bombers and 200 support planes. They flew the best non-U.S. planes money could buy, including Mirage F-1s and Soviet MiGs from the 29 on down. But despite having weathered 10 years of combat during the war with Iran, Iraq's Air Force was defeated in days. Planes that weren't shot out of the sky were blasted on the ground by F-111s and other fighter bombers. The Iraqis moved their planes into heavily reinforced aircraft hangars and bomb-proof revetments. The Allies countered by dropping hardened laser-guided bombs. Eventually, they destroyed 375 of Iraq's 594 impregnable shelters.
Chap it. Impact. Okay.
By the 9th day of the war, Iraq's airfields were in ruins. The Iraqi Air Force apparently decided the only way to survive was to run.
You know, Iraq really had a good Air Force. It was well-equipped, MiG-29s, Mirages. It was well-trained. I've met Iraqi pilots, and they're good. These guys are not slouches. They pulled off some fantastic missions in the Iran-Iraq War. But their problem, their weakness was they were very centrally controlled, and they were tied to their ground control. So when the Iraqis took off, many times they were blind because we took out the communications, we took out the radar sites, and then once we got them in the air, they were more easily engaged and shot down. But the other thing is, because we made it look easy, don't think it was easy. Those air-to-air engagements were a struggle, and our guys risked it all, but they pulled it off.
Perhaps the greatest mistake made by coalition planners before the Gulf War began was underestimating the threat posed by Iraq's Scud ballistic missiles. Militarily, Scuds were insignificant, but politically, Scud attacks on Israel and Saudi Arabia could have torn the coalition apart. The political importance of hunting down the Scuds was so great that the best aircraft on hand was assigned to the task. That plane was the brand new F-15E fighter bomber. A dual-role fighter, the F-15E has the air-to-air combat capability of the F-15C, plus the ability to fly night bombing missions in bad weather at altitudes as low as 200 feet, while carrying 24,500 pounds of ordnance. In keeping with the Eagle's no-expense-spared history, the F-15E is equipped with the finest weapons system available. The heart of the system is the same radar in every F-15, the APG-70. When used in a bombing role, this powerful radar gives pilots sharp views of the targets, no matter what the weather. The E's two crewmen have a bewildering array of instruments to monitor. The front seater flies the airplane and guards against air-to-air threats, while the weapons system operator in the back seat monitors 4 screens with up to 23 different displays.
From very long distances, you can locate things on the ground that look just like a picture that you take from an overhead satellite.
Near photograph capability.
And you need very low squint angles to do that, so I don't necessarily have to be at high altitude. I can be down at 300 or 500 feet and get very much the same picture I would if I cruise over at 25,000.
F-15Es patrolled the Iraqi border ready to attack Scud sites. On the ground, British and American commandos went deep behind enemy lines, looking for Scuds and calling in airstrikes when they found them. But Iraq had over 1,200 Scuds, and the vast size of the region made finding them extremely difficult. Their very lack of sophistication made them easy to set up and fire, and their mobility made them easy to hide.
We believe that they adapted their tactics to the threat, which for them was the threat of being obliterated by a laser-guided bomb from an F-15E. They started to come out only at night. They started to take advantage of environmental conditions, which made it difficult for us to see them. And they began to move their operations areas farther north.
The intense air attacks on Scud sites did seem to have an impact. In the first 5 days of the war, Iraq fired an average of 5 Scuds per day. In the month that followed, the average went down to 1 per day. Although Scud hunts became their priority, F-15E pilots were also sent against many other important, hard-to-hit targets such as radar sites and airfields. During the Gulf War, the 48 F-15Es sent to Saudi Arabia flew over 2,200 sorties. They dropped more than 11 million pounds of bombs. By all accounts, the new airplane and its pilots performed superbly in combat. But flying 300 feet above the ground at night in heavily defended territory will always be extremely dangerous, no matter how good the pilot or how advanced the aircraft. 2 F-15Es were lost in the first week of the war. This is the F-117 Nighthawk, better known as the stealth fighter. Until recently, the sight of this plane at an air show would have been unthinkable. For years, the F-117 was one of the Air Force's most closely guarded secrets. But in 1991, this mysterious plane was the cornerstone of the strategic air campaign waged against Iraq. And literally overnight, the F-117 underwent a drastic change of image. Prior to January 16th, it was a symbol of wasteful defense spending. The day after, it represented the high-tech military juggernaut that crushed Iraq. The F-117 is a product of Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Group, which for decades has designed the most top-secret planes in the Air Force inventory, including the SR-71 Blackbird. In many ways, the Blackbird was the first stealth aircraft, its sleek shape making it harder to spot on radar. Stealth technology was developed in response to the heavy losses the United States suffered in Vietnam from surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided guns. The development of radar-seeking missiles was one response to the threat. The other was a top-secret effort to create an aircraft that would be nearly impossible to detect by radar. If it could be built, such a plane would bring the element of surprise back to air warfare. The first known result of the program was Have Blue, the predecessor of today's stealth fighter. Have Blue remains classified to this day, but it proved so stealthy that in 1978, Congress authorized production of an F-117 prototype, codenamed Senior Trend. By 1981, funds were allocated for an entire wing of F-117s, 59 planes in all. A new facility was built specifically to keep the highly classified project under wraps. The stealth base at Tonopah Test Range sits deep in the Nevada desert. Tonopah is so remote that pilots and crew are flown in for week-long stays. This secrecy was considered necessary because of the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union during the 1980s. The F-117 was a major leap forward in the evolution of fighter aircraft, and the Air Force knew it. Even the shape of the plane was kept secret for years. The secrecy was eased somewhat after December 1989, when the Nighthawk struck the first blow in Panama. Still, the only concrete details that emerged were about its cost: $52 million per plane, $8.2 billion for the total program. Crashes during training caused skeptics to brand the plane the Wobbly Goblin.
All the pilots who fly it really think that's a bogus rap. There was one that was crashed in testing in the books called the Have Blue program when this was started. And we've lost two that were operational tonight. And it was probably, no one really knows why they crashed. It was probably due to spatial disorientation, but the airplane is rock steady. I don't know if any airplane is as stable as this thing is. The nose is cut, and you won't see any perpendicular surfaces go around. The four probes in the front are not machine guns, and they're not holographic projectors. They're called pitot tubes, air sensing tubes we use. We have a 4-channel fly-by-wire flight control system. We have 4 pitot tubes. The grids in front replace normal intakes and are put on there for radar cross-section reduction. Also, you'll notice around the airplane where the canopies meet and when the weapons bay is opened and on the gear doors, you'll see sawtooth edges. That's also done to break up a radar signature. Anytime you have two edges that meet, you end up with a reflective edge. One of the things that you'll notice also, from the bottom, once the gear goes up, there's an elliptical shape to it. You'll notice how it's hard to see which way the airplane is. We call it aspect angle for other pilots, which way the airplane's approaching, your angle to it. And so as you see it, it can almost look like when the airplane's turning or straight and level, like it has a saucer type shape below that's rounded. If you look at the tail, you don't see any visible exhaust. The reason is that ledge or line that runs across there, there's a set of bricks that goes the full width of the tail. We take and spread the exhaust out across the width to cool it, run across these bricks, and then duct it up so that there's no jet blast immediately behind the airplane, it's above. That gets rid of all of our infrared signature below. And if you imagine you're an air-to-air fighter trying to find us from above, you'll see that the tails slope out. If you go directly at 6 o'clock, the tail will cover the exhaust from right behind the airplane.
The F-117's skin of radar-absorbent material, or RAM, absorbs whatever lingering radar energy that hasn't been deflected by the Nighthawk's faceted surfaces. This turret contains the F-117's forward-looking infrared sensor, part of its highly classified navigation and attack system. Under the fuselage sits a downward-looking infrared sensor. Both the FLIR and BLIR are equipped with lasers that spotlight targets for laser-guided precision weapons. And precision is a must, since the Nighthawk can only carry 2 2,000-pound bombs. The bombs must be carried internally to keep the plane's radar cross-section stealthy. Until the Gulf War began, even those familiar with the F-117 weren't completely certain that stealth would work against a sophisticated air defense system. But the coalition's air command was gambling that stealth would work as advertised. They planned to send F-117s alone into Baghdad, the most heavily defended city in Iraq. January 17th, 1991, 3 a.m. Saudi time. 2 squadrons of F-117 Nighthawks launched simultaneous strikes across the city of Baghdad, dropping approximately 60 laser-guided bombs on Iraqi communications buildings, air defense bunkers, ammunition bunkers, Scud missile sites, and the headquarters of the Iraqi Air Force. Within minutes, the foundation of Iraq's complex command and control network has been crippled, and the war in the Persian Gulf has begun. It is a mission Nighthawk pilots have anticipated for months.
We deployed through Langley Air Force Base, and then from there we made one hop, about 15 and a half hours, to a place called Khamis Mashhad in Saudi Arabia, southern part, almost maybe 100 miles north of Yemen.
F-117s from the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing, 42 in all, were sent to a Saudi base far from Iraqi missile range. But their great distance from Baghdad would require them to fly 2,000 miles round trip every mission. On the plus side, Khamis Mushat was a state-of-the-art airbase.
I had the honor of leading the first attack on Baghdad. There were 10 of us that went downtown before the rest of the support package came in. And I have to tell you that Baghdad was the damnedest fireworks show that I'd ever seen. And the city was lit up like it was a holiday, just in terms of all the street lights and traffic out there, even though it was still 3 or 4 in the morning. But then you take the city that is all lit up and you accent it first with arcs of 23 millimeter that are very high rate of fire weapons that's shooting almost horizontally. You could look down and see all that.
Despite the ground fire, the F-117s performed the mission they were designed for: covert surgical strikes against hardened, high-value, heavily defended targets. Flying at night, F-117s dropped 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs from 25,000 feet and hit targets the size of shoeboxes. Apparently, the Iraqi army never saw them coming. But on the first night, flying in radio silence, pilots had no way of knowing just how successful their attacks had been.
There's no doubt about it that the stealth technology has revolutionized air operations and warfare in total. The 117 guys were the ones that flew the tough missions downtown in Baghdad, one of the most heavily defended targets in the world. The fact that they were able to go in there without escort, without defense suppression, meant that we did not have to attack hundreds of targets located in residential areas, and kept down overall casualties, overall loss of life, and a lot of collateral damage.
Although it's called the stealth fighter, to date, the F-117 has flown in combat exclusively as a light bomber. The F-117 carries laser-guided bombs, which are actually conventional 2,000-pound bombs fitted with special noses that steer towards targets marked by laser beams. Laser-guided bombs are very accurate, but they are also very expensive. Most of the bombs dropped during the Gulf War were unguided gravity bombs. But for targets in urban areas, the coalition opted for precision weapons, and for true precision, those bombs were dropped by F-117s. The accuracy of the Nighthawks was such that although they flew only 2% of total combat sorties in the Gulf, they covered 40% of all strategic targets. F-117s dropped over 2,000 tons of bombs and flew more than 6,900 combat hours. But even precision weapons can result in the loss of innocent lives. In one well-publicized incident, an F-117 dropped laser-guided bombs on a target identified as an Iraqi communications center. Still, even Iraq concedes its civilian casualties were relatively light. In World War II, whole cities were targeted for destruction. Stealth gave the Allies the opportunity to change the emphasis of air war away from genocide and back to strategy. During the Gulf War, the F-15E and the F-117 Nighthawk received a great deal of publicity for their performance as deep interdiction bombers. Much was made of their high-tech systems, their ability to drop precision bombs, and their prowess as all-weather night fighters. But 84 much older, less heralded planes flew more than 4,000 sorties in the Gulf, largely at night, in bad weather, carrying heavy loads of laser-guided bombs. These were the F-111F aardvarks. In test after test, the F-111 proved its ability to fly very low, very fast, even in bad weather at night, and still hit its targets. The EF-111 jamming plane served alongside the F-111 bomber during the Gulf War. Together, they're a deadly combination.
The F-111 was the stalwart of the strategic air campaign. Behind the F-117, which can do things that an F-111 can't do just because it can go places and not be shot. Places the F-111 can't go because of its larger radar cross-section. makes it easier for the enemy to acquire it and shoot it. However, F-111s travel in packs. They each carry 4 laser-guided bombs. That's 16 precision aim points per formation. So if you sent F-111s to a bridge, the bridge was going down.
Impact.
The F-111F's pave tack pod lets the plane illuminate its targets with a laser beam. Paveway laser-guided bombs then follow the signal down to the ground. Strikes are accurate within a few feet. F-111s aren't thought of as being tank killers, but in the Gulf, the plane was very effectively used against armor. F-111s cruised over Iraqi lines using their FLIR pods to sweep search back and forth across the ground looking for targets. In the week before the ground campaign began, F-111s killed up to 150 tanks per night. Overall, they had over 1,000 verified kills of Iraqi armor. This is the Panavia Tornado. During the Gulf War, this versatile multi-role aircraft flew with Britain's Royal Air Force, the Royal Saudi Air Force, and the Italian Air Force. Tornadoes were assigned some of the most dangerous missions of the war, attacking heavily defended airfields in Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Tornado missions required pilots to fly daring, low-level, high-speed attacks hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. The assignment was dangerous, and some Tornado pilots never returned. In 1972, the British Aircraft Corporation joined forces with West Germany's Messerschmitt Bölkow-Blohm and Air Italia to form the Panavia Consortium. Together, the top aerospace technicians of the 3 countries created a 2-seat variable geometry airframe adaptable to nearly every combat mission. Panavia fitted their new jet with a full complement of computerized systems. A powerful radar was installed in a high-level interceptor version of the Tornado. A navigation and attack computer allows the plane to fly as a deep interdiction fighter-bomber. The Tornado's twin engines and swing wings give it power and flexibility. The basic airframe was deliberately designed to be adapted to different roles, much like the U.S. Navy's multipurpose A-6. The Tornado F-3 variant is an air superiority interceptor, while the Tornado GR-1 is an all-weather bomber. The GR-1 can fly at 600 miles per hour, 200 feet above the ground. But standard Tornadoes aren't equipped with laser target designators, essential equipment for dropping precision bombs. A new version of the Tornado fitted with a laser designator was rushed into service during the Gulf War. It flew alongside an equally new variant, the Tornado GR-1A. The GR-1A is an all-weather reconnaissance plane that was used extensively to hunt for Scud missile sites.
This is an electronic countermeasures EW jamming pod designed to confuse enemy hostile radars. And then further to the right, this is not a bomb. This is, in fact, a 2,250-litre fuel tank, which will extend our range, and we carry 2 of these. Moving on to the fuselage of the aircraft, of the Tornado GR-1A, the difference between a GR-1 and a GR-1A is that there are no guns mounted on this aeroplane. Instead, we have internally mounted infrared reconnaissance equipment, and immediately visual is one of the sideways-looking infrared sensor windows here, and there is one on the right-hand side as well. And within this fairing, underneath the fuselage, is a window which would open, which is an infrared line scanner, which will give us complete 180 degrees horizon to horizon coverage.
Britain's Royal Air Force is the principal operator of the airplane. But at one time or another, virtually all Tornado pilots have flown together during NATO training missions. Generally, these missions involve Tornado F-3s flying combat air patrol, while Tornado GR-1s practice low-level, high-speed strikes. But when the Gulf War erupted, GR-1 pilots had to adapt quickly to a dangerous new environment. One thing that helped ease the learning curve was the close-knit relationship of Tornado crews. Like the teams who fly F-111s, Tornado pilots and bombardier navigators develop bonds that help them surmount daunting obstacles. When Kuwait was overrun by Iraq, Tornado pilots and the rest of the British Expeditionary Force found themselves facing the greatest challenge of their careers. They were deployed to the Gulf on August 9, 1990, less than a week after the invasion. Eventually, 25,000 British soldiers were sent to the war zone. Britain's Royal Air Force contributed 135 aircraft, including 18 Tornado F-3 fighters, 12 Buccaneer bombers, 12 Jaguar fighter bombers, and 46 Tornado GR-1 attack and reconnaissance planes. During the Gulf War, the dozen RAF Jaguars flew 617 sorties, flying combat air patrol and bombing missions. To camouflage their aircraft in the new battleground, the RAF changed the color of their planes from European green to desert pink. This also helped differentiate British Tornadoes from the Saudi and Italian models that flew during the Gulf War.
I arrived in the Gulf 2 days before the war started. Had I not had training with Americans using the procedures that we actually adopted during the Gulf War, it would have been very difficult at such short notice to have achieved the mission and to have achieved it so well.
Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone to find that the British and the U.S. Fighter squadrons are very similar, and their approach toward warfighting is very similar. But that's true of the majority of the members of the coalition. We trained together, and we practiced together, so to speak, and so when it came time to fight the war together, there was a cohesiveness there that permitted us to do what we thought we could do without any deference to who was doing it. And that's the important thing.
British forces were scattered across Saudi Arabia. They operated out of an airport parking lot in Tehran and bases in Riyadh, Tabuk, and Bahrain. The British found themselves living in desert tent cities and finished barracks. It all depended on the luck of the draw. Wherever they were, they worked alongside the other members of the multinational force. This included some 425,000 Americans and 137,000 troops from Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, as well as 7,000 troops who escaped from Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion. Pakistan, Czechoslovakia, Canada, Bangladesh, Syria, Argentina, Senegal, and Sierra Leone also sent in men, planes, and ships. Italy sent in 10 of its Tornadoes to fly air superiority missions. Altogether, more than 695,000 soldiers from around the globe were sent against the Iraqi army, which numbered close to 1 million. The Royal Saudi Air Force flew both Tornado interceptors and bombers. Mirage F-1s were flown by both friends and foes. F-1s from Qatar joined F-1s from the Free Kuwait Air Force, which flew with the Saudis.
I read stories about how the Saudis were not going to perform well. They performed superbly. I remember one Tornado mission, the guy had to cut a runway. He put every one of his bombs right down the center line of the runway. Certainly the example where the two Mirages were coming towards the oil fields and the Saudi flight lead rolled out right behind them. AWACS gave them a vector. So the idea that one kind of Air Force is not as good as another Air Force is really not true. You have great individuals in every Air Force, and you have guys that have a little trouble getting up to speed. That's true of all air forces. The key on how well an air force performs is how well your intelligence is and how well your command and control works. In this case, I think we had superb support from both.
Britain's Tornado GR-1s flew low-level bombing missions deep in Iraqi territory, and they took the heaviest losses of all coalition aircraft. The Tornado force represented just 4% of Allied air strength, but it suffered 26% of the casualties.
The problem was that the Iraqis had an awful lot of AAA guns to defend their airfields, and at night, to see this solid wall of tracer go up was something that no one had ever really experienced before, and it was very frightening and very distracting. Although it probably wasn't that effective, it certainly tends to take your eye off the ball.
Oh, come on, what fucking heading have I got here? Don't stop.
Lincoln and Stanford Buckeye, buckets behind you.
There are 20 to 25 of us killed every year in normal training accidents, and to be honest, the loss rate was no more than we would normally experience in peacetime, especially considering the amount of flying and the type of flying that was being done. Very low level, very demanding training indeed during the build-up to the war. So losing friends is something that's not new. It's something that we are used to. I mean, it never comes very easy, but it's something that's not that unusual.
5 Tornado pilots were killed in action. Another 7 were captured by the Iraqis and held as prisoners of war. Fortunately, the war was short. By March 1991, all Allied POWs were released to friendly forces. Another problem facing the RAF and all coalition pilots was the unusually poor weather in the Middle East. As any pilot will attest, things can get tricky when you're flying at night.
The weather was not beautiful desert, clear blue sky weather. There were a number of thunderstorms and with great turbulence. Now, because this aeroplane is only a very small aeroplane, and it only carries a limited amount of fuel, all our operations involved air-to-air refueling with one of our tanker aircraft. On some nights, we were actually tanking in very, very nasty thunderstorm and electronic storm weathers, where the aeroplanes were being buffeted around quite significantly, and all the pilots, to a man, did extremely well and to be able to make contact with the tanker aircraft and take the fuel.
But the major safety threat was still Iraq's surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. So after losing 5 planes in the first week, Tornadoes were sent to higher, safer altitudes. The RAF claimed this was done not because of the high loss rate, but because air superiority had been so quickly achieved that Tornadoes no longer needed to bomb airstrips. But the fact remains that although the Tornado is a versatile airframe, it was not designed for medium-level bombing, nor had its crews ever trained for that mission.
3, 2, 1. Should see an impact soon. Gone. Impact. Right, moving up the runway.
Dropping laser-guided bombs from medium altitudes was new to GR-1 pilots, who specialized in delivering their unguided JP-233 runway denial munitions from treetop level. But laser-guided bombs were also capable of blowing holes in Iraqi airstrips. However, JP-233s create a much wider circle of destruction. They carry 30 concrete cratering bomblets and 215 delayed fuse mines, making airstrip repair a hazardous enterprise.
Thomas, you little piece.
5 Tornadoes were lost during low-level attacks on Iraqi air bases. But although the bombers were sent to higher levels, the 6 reconnaissance Tornadoes continued to fly high-speed, low-level missions for the duration of the war, without a single loss.
I will say this, the Brits were very courageous. They took a lot of casualties, and my hat's off to them. They never missed a beat.
1 bomb gone, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bombs gone. Good hit.
The first Tornado GR-1 fighter bombers sent to the Gulf weren't equipped with built-in laser designators. So the RAF sent over a dozen Buccaneer bombers armed with pave-spike laser designators to mark targets for Tornadoes. GR-1s carrying paveway laser-guided bombs flew in 3 ships of 2 Tornadoes and 1 Buccaneer. Buccaneer navigators called the shots.
I'll be stopping the turn, mate. Okay, fine. Take it right and then left. Drink it right and left. Yeah, whatever you can to hold it. We're nearly over.
I was sent to the Gulf 3 weeks into the war, actually, because I was involved in a new project which was just coming into service at the time, which was a new laser designation pod called Tiled, and it was still under development at the time. So before we could take it out there, we had to actually develop it and get it fit to work and prove it worked before we deployed.
Okay, laser fire now.
Tiled stands for Thermal Imaging and Laser Designation. It was an experimental system rushed into service for the Gulf War. 5 Tornadoes were modified to accept the Tiled pod.
In the side that has 5 coconuts.
Tiled was successful, though as with every new weapon system, problems did arise.
Laser's not firing. Laser's not firing.
All the targets which were used during the precision bomb phase were all military targets, whether they be hardened air shelters or ammunition bunkers. They were all designed to prevent the Iraqi war machine from operating effectively.
Got the bridge.
There's no such thing as a clean war. You can't just take out the targets without killing people, or killing innocent people, if you like. But you can go a long way towards it by using guided weapons. When you're fighting from the air, you don't actually see much of the enemy. In fact, you don't see them at all. Even when you can see the targets you're bombing, you don't actually see people, especially when you're bombing from medium level. So you don't actually get the impression that you're fighting anybody at all. In training, we practice against targets, airfields or buildings out and around. And to a large extent, flying the war missions was exactly the same. It didn't feel any different, except for the fact that there was lead coming flying up at me every now and again.
Want to get out of here? Yeah, if you're right.
I didn't actually feel anything directly for or against the Iraqis. They were just the target, the job we had to do.
When ceasefire was called on March 3rd, the RAF had flown over 6,100 sorties, the largest number flown by any nation except the United States. The 5 Tiled Tornadoes flew 72 successful sorties in 17 days. The 6 GR-1A Recon Tornadoes flew 128 night sorties. And the 46 British GR-1s in the Gulf flew over 1,600 sorties. The U.S. naval buildup during the Gulf War was the largest such mobilization since World War II. 6 carrier battle groups massed in the Middle East, and the decks of those carriers roared non-stop. The sleek F-14 Tomcats were perhaps the best-known planes on board, and Marine Aviate Harriers were the other stars of the deck. But the Navy's key asset was actually the oldest, least glamorous plane on board, the venerable A-6. This late 50s design filled 3 crucial roles in the Gulf: tanking, electronic jamming, and long-range attack. Streaking in from the sea, A-6s were bold reminders of the deadly potential of power projection. A-6s have rolled off Grumman Aerospace Corporation assembly lines since the late 1950s. Over the years, the plane has gone from vacuum tubes to microcircuits. It was designed to fly in all weather conditions, both as a Marine close air support plane and a Navy long-range medium bomber. Flying complicated bombing missions requires a 2-man crew. As with F-111s, which fly similar missions, 2 aviators sit side by side, pilot on the left, bombardier navigator on the right. The A-6 looks much the same as it did 30 years ago, but inside, it's a different airplane. Computer bombing systems and terrain-following radar have been added to give the A-6 true ground-hugging, day and night, all-weather capability. The A-6E's target recognition attack multi-sensor, or TRAM pod, lets the airplane drop laser-guided bombs with great precision. An important variant of the A-6 went into service in 1970. The EA-6B Prowler jams enemy radar and communications. It can also fire radar-seeking HARM missiles at hostile positions.
The A-6 has been fundamental to the Navy and its interdiction efforts, and again proved very valuable in this war. We used the A-6, like the 111 and the F-15Es, early in the war to attack targets such as airfields, communication sites. And then later we used them with precision munitions and also CBUs against troops in the field in Kuwait.
The Ka-60 tanker plane is another A-6 spin-off. Ka-6s refuel Navy planes and transfer gas from huge KC-10 tankers and deliver it to carriers below. Like the fighter and bomber planes, tankers were invaluable. The Strategic Air Command deployed 256 KC-135 tankers and 46 KC-10 tankers during the Gulf War. Tankers are flying gas stations. Air refueling gives gas-guzzling fighters and bombers the ability to stay in the air. This was crucial in the Gulf War, where some strike aircraft had to fly 1,000 miles to their targets, then 1,000 miles home again. Every aircraft from every service, as well as many coalition planes, used U.S. Air Force tankers.
I think in any recent war, if you ask any fighter pilot who his hero is, he'd probably say the air-to-air tanker guys. I myself can remember in Vietnam being over Hanoi Island, almost out of gas, and here comes a 135 way up north of where he ought to be because of the enemy threat, and turning around, falling in behind, and getting enough fuel to get home.
There was one position there, and I forget the name of it, where it was a common tanker position. Pretty much day or night, you can go to this O'Malley. You can go to this spot and find airborne fuel. Go there, top off, bring it back to the ship, and basically have a lot of gas airborne for returning strikers.
And we're latched.
Refueling gets to be second nature. Every guy that flew fighters over there probably did 200 plus hookups during the war. We met tankers about 70 miles from our departure point, and we refueled with the tankers all the way down through the Gulf and into our destination over in the Emirates. But 10, maybe 8 refuelings, quite a few.
Especially when you load up the A6 with 10,000 pounds of ordnance, 10 1,000-pound bombs. There's a lot of drag out there, and you can suck down an enormous amount of gas. And it was always a little comforting to know that there was a tanker up there and you could hit it once you came out of bad guy country.
During Operation Desert Storm, tankers flew approximately 15,500 sorties, refueled 46,000 aircraft, and offloaded 110 million gallons of fuel. During the Gulf War, more than 150 coalition ships patrolled the waters near Iraq. More than 100 of these ships were part of the United States Navy. The 6 aircraft carriers in the Gulf region represented half the Navy's active carrier strength. Generally, each ship has about 85 planes on station. Aircraft carriers are floating cities where space is at a premium and all operations serve the needs of the flight deck. Deck activity is always frenzied, but never more so than during wartime, when pilots, sailors, and aircrew work exhausting shifts with little regard for the rise and fall of the sun. Carrier life is extremely regimented, and for good reason. Standing in the wrong place at the wrong time can be fatal. The noise on deck is deafening. Crewmen communicate with hand signals, intercoms, and headsets. Shirt colors quickly let you know who does what. Blue shirts keep planes from rolling off the flight deck. Red shirts handle bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Below the deck, they ready the weapons that pilots take into battle. An accident here can cripple a ship, so every action is checked and double-checked. In wartime, though, the pace can be exhausting. White and silver are the colors of safety men. Yellow shirts direct taxi traffic. Green shirts hook planes up to catapults. And everyone answers to the air boss, the chief controller of flight operations. No plane leaves the deck without the boss's approval. The air boss is a veteran flyer, and his word is law. In the handler's room, men move toy airplanes on a replica of the flight deck. This is the handler's table, nicknamed the Ouija board. The Ouija board tells the traffic, fuel, ordnance, and safety men the status of every plane on the ship. When toy planes are moved on the board, real planes are moved on the deck.
He's going to go on top because he's going to shoot later on.
Once in the air, pilots are handed over to the Carrier Air Traffic Control Center, a dark chamber in the bowels of the ship. Non-stop electronic communication keeps crews in touch with their mother ships. Combat missions can be taxing, but Navy pilots seem to unanimously agree that landing a plane on a carrier deck in bad weather is far more frightening.
I had one where we were manning up on the carrier. It was about 11:30 at night, very, very dark, raining cats and dogs, and there was a thunderstorm that for some reason was centered right on top of the ship, and I was scared. I mean, I was scared. And down to 2 miles in just pouring down rain, can't see the ship, at a mile, there it is, land. And, I tell you what, it's an eye-opener. It's an eye-opener.
Flying at high subsonic speeds 200 feet above the desert floor might also look difficult, but it's not, thanks to terrain-following navigation systems. But during the Gulf War, Intruder pilots flew at much higher levels than they were accustomed to, often above 10,000 feet. This helped them survive flak and surface-to-air missile attacks. The number of airplanes shot down by the Iraqis was low, but it did happen.
I fly the A6E Intruder.
It was extremely difficult. Jeff was assigned to VA-35 at the time, and that was my previous squadron. I had flown some with Jeff. I knew everyone in the squadron, and just prior to our first mission into Iraq is when we had gotten word that some of those airplanes, the A6s off of the Saratoga, had actually been shot down. It was a difficult time.
I think that the whole experience was much easier than we thought it was going to be. However, we unfortunately lost an airplane and lost a crew. As a matter of fact, the pilot was my roommate, so one day you've got a roommate, and the next day you don't. So yeah, the war was easy, but it was not without cost.
Most of the planes used in the war were equipped with state-of-the-art technology. The A6 Intruder had a different advantage.
Given the mission of the A6, the crew coordination is very important. And that's what gives us the advantage over other airplanes, is that the interaction that we had between the two crew members. Now, specifically during the war, the pilot, as we'd be approaching the target, would basically be flying an unpredictable flight path. So he'd be bending the airplane back and forth while the BN, the Bombardier Navigator, would have his head inside the hood trying to pick out the specific radar blip. As the pilot's doing that lazy maneuvering back and forth to evade the radar systems that are on the ground, he's looking for the missiles, he's looking for the AAA, and then the BN is sweetening up the targeting solution.
You see anything on the clear? I can see something hard. All right, let's go for it. There we go, rolling in.
Where you fly with one other guy, primarily, you get to the point where you can communicate using mic clicks and glances and not have to verbalize. It becomes very, very close, very, very coordinated. And that's what makes this airplane special, and that's what makes it work so well.
Intruders usually flew in groups of 4 and dropped both laser-guided bombs and unguided gravity bombs. Laser-guided bombs were the weapons of choice, but poor weather over Iraq often made it impossible for laser designators to lock onto targets. On poor weather days, A6Es dropped cluster bombs and other unguided munitions. Intruders were also sent out to stop Iraqi naval vessels carrying anti-ship missiles and sea mines.
Those things are difficult because they're moving targets. It's not like a land target that you say, hey, I know where it is today, I know where it's going to be tomorrow. And because they're constantly moving, they're difficult to find and they're difficult to attack.
But not all A6s were carrier-based. Marine Corps pilots flew Intruders and Prowlers from land bases in Saudi Arabia. During the peak of Operation Desert Storm, 93,000 Marines, almost half the active duty force, were in the Gulf area. Marine Intruders flew close air support and interdiction missions to protect the soldiers on the ground. The Marines brought 20 A6E Intruders and 15 EA-6B Prowlers to the Persian Gulf. Like their Navy counterparts, Marine A6 crews brought a variety of weapons to bear against hostile forces. But Marine pilots have closer ties to ground troops than other aviators. Their number one priority is to do whatever they can to aid and protect Marines on the ground. But whether flying from land or sea, A6s proved that an old design is not necessarily an outdated design.
Given the jet that we have, I think we do very well. And I think if you look at the overall picture, our performance in Desert Storm was fantastic. In our squadron alone, 9 airplanes, we dropped 1.2 million pounds of ordnance in Desert Storm. And that's a lot of bombs.
Race, back away. Get down to 19 point. Boom, boom, boom. What a great hit.
From January 17th to February 27th, Navy and Marine pilots flew some 26,000 combat and support sorties. After the war, the Secretary of Defense, Richard Cheney, said, "In a crisis overseas, the first thing somebody asks is, where's the nearest aircraft carrier?" Certainly, carrier mobility was a critical factor in August 1990, when the USS Eisenhower and the USS Independence raced to the Gulf after Iraq invaded Kuwait. The swift deployment of Navy carriers, combined with the prompt arrival of Air Force F-15s, might have been the reason Iraq did not continue its push into Saudi Arabia. Sea power also might have helped dissuade Iraq from carrying out its threats to use chemical weapons against soldiers and civilians. The United States let it be known that its carrier battle groups might be equipped with special weapons, the military's polite term for nuclear arms. It is unlikely that the coalition would have permitted the use of nuclear weapons in the Gulf. But if thousands of Arabs, Israelis, and Americans had died in a nerve gas attack, opinions could have changed. In any event, just the threat of nuclear arms seems to have had a chilling effect. Aircraft carriers let the United States quickly respond to crises. In the Gulf War, naval aviation played a crucial part in the coalition victory. February 26, 1991. After a 6-week air campaign, the ground war against Iraq begins.
Good hit. Lads, grenade on the next from us. Let's press round. Come on, lads, get moving. Let's go, let's go!
F-16 Fighting Falcons were the workhorses of the Gulf War. More F-16s flew into combat than any other type of aircraft. In the early 1970s, the United States Air Force faced a unique dilemma. It was preparing to bring into service the best fighter of all time, the F-15 Eagle. But F-15s cost so much that they could only be deployed in small numbers. The West needed an inexpensive fighter to replace the F-4 Phantom, since the Soviet Union was filling the skies with low-cost, high-speed aircraft. The Soviets believed that even if the West had better planes, NATO could be overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers. So in 1972, the U.S. Air Force called for proposals for a lightweight aircraft that could serve as both a dogfighter and a ground attacker. The winner was a single-engine, single-pilot General Dynamics design, the F-16. GD took proven systems from other planes and married them to a highly aerodynamic fuselage. Price was kept to a relatively low $12 million per plane, thanks to a unique production agreement between GD and 4 NATO countries. F-16 parts would be mass-produced in America and Europe, and the monetary risk would be spread among the partners. In 1979, the F-16 went into service with the United States Air Force. By the 1990s, 17 other countries were flying it for air defense. The popularity of the F-16 is easy to explain. It's small, very fast, and highly maneuverable. Great characteristics for a dogfighter. In the hands of the right pilot, it can hold its own against anything flying today. And the F-16 has multi-mission capability. In other words, it can also drop bombs.
If you look up and try to see an F-16 from 12,000, 13,000 feet coming down the chute in a 45-degree dive or so, and you look up at that airplane, you will not see it. You will not see it. At 8,000 feet, you might see it. And by the time you hear the sound, the bomb is going off in your face.
Aviators like the way the F-16 responds in the air, and they also like its unique cockpit. The airplane's seat is set back at a 30-degree angle. This helps pilots cope with the plane's 9G turn capability. The plane's bubble canopy gives pilots unobstructed vision. But the most striking feature of the F-16 is its fly-by-wire control system. The F-16 was the first fully electric fighter. All control commands are relayed by wires, not by cables or linkage controls. Pilot and machine become a seamless unit bonded by the plane's onboard computer. The F-16's APG-68 radar gives pilots a clear picture of air and ground threats. When the Falcon is in dogfighting mode, it can fire its 2 wingtip-mounted AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, as well as Sparrow and AMRAAM missiles. In August 1990, F-16 squadrons began shipping out to the Persian Gulf. Squadrons were drawn from the active Air Force, as well as the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve. The 249 F-16s sent over flew out of at least 4 bases scattered across Saudi Arabia. In the Gulf War, America's team included men and women. For Air Force personnel, female crew chiefs and tanker pilots were nothing new. But for some members of the coalition, particularly the Saudis, the sight of women working alongside men on the flight line was alarming. The Saudis were even more unnerved when they saw female officers giving orders to men.
They reported Gulf, but it's got to be Foxtrot. We're asking for the time. Down for now.
But the sexual integration of the U.S. military was just one of the major changes that followed the Vietnam War.
There's no doubt about it. The Vietnam experience affected all of us deeply and provided us great insights. It started out at the national level, the President, Secretary of Defense, who were involved in detail in everything we did, and yet they would leave to the military those decisions that were the military's, picking of targets, for example. I think the fact that we fought the war unrelentingly is also an example. Where in Vietnam we'd use bombing halts and attempt to negotiate and do those kinds of things that would delay the conflict and prolong the suffering. I think all of us were death against that.
During January and February 1991, American F-16s bombed Iraqi military facilities, tanks, airfields, chemical factories, and supply lines. They also attacked Iraqi troops in and around occupied Kuwait. F-16s did not carry any laser-guided smart bombs into battle. The airplane isn't fitted with the laser targeting devices needed to drop such weapons. Because their primary targets were military positions in the desert, F-16s usually dropped cluster bomb units and 2,000-pound gravity bombs, weapons with no built-in guidance systems. Many were leftovers from the Vietnam War. F-16s dropped these bombs as part of the coalition's strategy of overwhelming force. The plan was to hit Iraq, particularly its ground troops, as hard as possible for as long as it took to break their will and force a surrender. When bombing, F-16 pilots activate the continuously computing impact point ordnance aiming system, a device that takes much of the inaccuracy out of dumb bomb delivery. A computer calculates airspeed, bomb weight, distance to target, and other factors, so when bombs are dropped, they have a high PK, or probability of kill. However, the higher a plane flies, the worse the PK.
Our bomb is designed around a very, very smart computer in the airplane to, once you pickle that bomb off, it's a hunk of iron falling to the ground. And although it's still a very accurate system, you're talking about, 50 feet is a very average bomb from 10 to 15,000 feet. But 50 feet sometimes is the difference between a miss and a hit. So our PK was certainly not as good as the very, very smart bombers.
F-16s and many other coalition planes were restricted to medium altitudes because of Iraq's Vietnam-style tactic of spraying the sky with bullets and surface-to-air missiles.
General Horner and I were obsessed, and that's probably the right word, with having the minimum loss of life. And so there were restrictions that were placed on all of the airplanes as far as minimum altitudes they could fly during the day. And the F-16 was one of the airplanes that had to put up with our restrictions. And so we did not expect them to be as accurate. It's just a plain physics.
By the end of the Gulf War, 2 F-16s had been lost to surface-to-air missiles, and 2 others were down by anti-aircraft guns. F-16 performance was also diminished by poor weather, and later by the oil well fires that fouled the skies. But not all the F-16s were blind. 72 flew with lantern navigation pods containing terrain-following radar and a forward-looking infrared sensor. Perhaps the major test of the F-16's power and versatility came on February 24th, 1991. When, after 6 weeks of air assault, the ground war began.
During the last part of the war, just before and when the Army came in, the sense of urgency of the target sets became more real because now they're going to be risking their lives. Before, it was just us in the airplanes, and we fought our own little war. But when you added the Army in, now we knew somebody else was involved that we had to help, which now the urgency of whether getting to your target, taking out exactly the target that they want you to take out, became a real player.
Okay. There you go. Good job. I'll get you smoked it.
Throughout the Gulf War, F-16s attacked soldiers of the Iraqi Army and the elite Republican Guard. Studies have shown that when a military unit, no matter how capable or motivated, drops beneath the 50% combat strength level, it becomes all but useless. The coalition hoped that constant air attacks would cause so many desertions, surrenders, wounds, and deaths in the Iraqi ranks that its entire frontline force would fall below the 50% mark. Their goal, however, was not to kill every Iraqi soldier on the battlefield.
We could kill a lot of people if we wanted to using, for example, cluster bomb units over large areas. When in fact we went with, for example, laser-guided bombs against tanks. And the enemy knew this, and immediately, as soon as they parked their tank, they'd get away, and you'd see the slit trenches appear around the tanks.
Tanks were key targets for F-16s, Apache gunships, and A-10s. Iraq had the 4th largest army in the world, and tank warfare was one of that army's strengths. F-16s often dropped cluster bomb units such as these on or near Iraqi armor. They were somewhat effective, though nowhere near as lethal to Iraq's top-of-the-line tanks as Maverick missiles. When the ground war began and tank killing became priority one, Maverick was the F-16 pilot's weapon of choice. This is the A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog. In an age of stealth fighters and smart bombs, the A-10 is a primitive airplane. It is neither fast, nor elegant, nor state-of-the-art.
Okay, I'm in from the southwest, ops check 3.8. I'm setting up the bombs. Copy, you're gonna get one pass at it. Copy that.
A-10s were the most vulnerable combat planes in the Gulf, but they were deadly efficient at their mission, destroying enemy tanks.
Very, very nice shot.
Although it looks like an old design, the A-10 is one of the youngest planes in the Air Force inventory. It was developed by Fairchild Industries in the 1970s to defend the NATO nations against a Soviet ground attack. The A-10 is built around a gun, the 21-foot Gao-8 Avenger cannon, which spits out 4,200 shells per minute. A-10s can linger over target areas for hours, swooping in low to attack with cannon blazing. Flying low exposes the Warthog to ground fire, but the plane is protected by its rugged titanium shell and redundant systems. All the aircraft's major systems have backups. The plane was built to take severe punishment and get its pilots home. A-10s have been in service since 1977, but they have never been favorites of the Air Force leadership, who generally prefer high-tech, high-flying aircraft such as the F-16. The A-10 is anything but high-tech. In fact, the plane looks and flies more like a World War II-era fighter. Warthogs are flown by stick and rudder controls, not by onboard computers. Though they carry some advanced systems, A-10 cockpits are still dominated by old-fashioned dials and gauges. This lack of sophistication can be an advantage. A-10s are far less expensive than F-16s, and they take punishment their supersonic cousins would have difficulty surviving. But as the 1980s ended, the A-10 seemed destined for the scrap heap. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc made the possibility of fighting a ground war in Europe remote. A-10s were scattered among a few Air Force units, the Air Force Reserve and the Air National Guard. But the Gulf War thrust the Warthog into frontline combat. It was rumored that the Air Force had not wanted to send the A-10s over at all because they feared the slow-flying planes would be easy prey for Iraqi anti-aircraft guns.
I heard stories about how we held the A-10 from deploying. That's absolutely untrue. They came at their appointed time and went to their appointed place and served superbly. We used the A-10 and the F-16s, AV-8s, and F-18s to provide sort of a fundamental attack system against the Kuwaiti theater of operations. In addition, the A-10s were invaluable in doing things like search and rescue and Scud hunts out in the western area during daylight hours.
On January 17, 1991, A-10s were among the 668 coalition aircraft that took to the air for the first massive assault of the Gulf War. Missions were long, and pilots were taxed to their mental and physical limits.
I flew 3 missions on the first day, a total of about 8 hours of flying time and about 12 hours in the cockpit. When you came back from a mission, you didn't even get out. You hot pit refueled as you sat there with engines running, going over with the intel people on what you did, where you went, and how it all worked out. They gave you current intel, and then you moved over to another slot where they put the bombs and guns on board.
A-10s were in constant danger of attack from Iraqi surface-to-air missiles. To stop the SAMs, F-4G Wild Weasels were sent in with radar-seeking missiles. With their radar neutralized, Iraqi soldiers fired blindly at aircraft noise. But the A-10 is relatively quiet. So quiet, the Iraqis called it the silent gun.
9 times out of 10, as you're rolling in on a target, you're concentrating so much on the bombing run that you really can't think about the AAA. If you do, you're going to have a lousy pass. You're usually hearing it from your wingmen saying they're shooting you up pretty good, AAA, you better start moving. You pull off into the cloud, hopefully that they're only going with a visual type of shot at you.
Got a good Maverick lock. Okay, are you sure there's something in there? Okay, firm. Okay, fire, I'm off west.
You don't think that there's 3 guys in that tank that you just put a Maverick. You think, well, that was just a tank. And I think you depersonalize it yourself. If you think about it, tube and tents, and sit there at night between the Scud attacks, and then, yeah, it's going to drive you crazy. A lot of guys go to church a lot all of a sudden, and they see things different ways.
The A-10 was the least sophisticated strike airplane in the Gulf, but it was also one of the deadliest. The 144 A-10s sent to Southwest Asia flew almost 8,100 missions. They destroyed more than 1,000 enemy tanks and thousands of other vehicles and artillery pieces. A-10s can carry up to 16,000 pounds of ordnance on 11 external stations, including cluster bombs and Maverick missiles for ground attack, and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles for air-to-air combat. But more often than not, pilots used their Avenger cannons against tanks, and in a first, against an Iraqi helicopter. Maverick was the A-10's other primary tank-killing weapon. These 500-pound guided missiles reach supersonic speed when they hit their targets, and not even the best armor can survive a direct hit. There are 2 types of Mavericks. Television-guided missiles are used in daylight. The missile sees contrasts between objects and backgrounds. Maverick is a fire-and-forget weapon, so when a pilot fires his missile, the video image cuts off. Infrared Mavericks, which were used in great numbers in the Gulf, detect targets based on differences in temperature. Since metal cools at a slower speed than sand, it was easy for pilots to spot tanks in the desert.
Okay, I've got what appears to be a building and some distinct hot spots around it.
Roger, that's your target.
I got a mover.
Mavericks were sometimes used by A-10s equipped with pavepenny pods. Pavepenny detects the laser beams used to mark targets by laser designation planes. A-10 pilots have earned their reputation as down-and-dirty fighters by making the most of the limited materials on hand. For instance, the pilots of the 355th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the only dedicated night-flying A-10 unit in the Gulf, sighted targets by using the video system from their infrared Mavericks as a sort of poor man's forward-looking infrared scanner. The night fighters also employed the primitive but effective tactic of dropping flares over their targets. A-10 pilots sometimes wore night vision goggles and sighted targets through regular binoculars. Ground troops or other pilots called in airstrikes. Then A-10s flew in, dropped their blinding flares, then strafed and bombed targets at will. The Iraqis did their best to hide their armor, to little avail. Here, a night-flying A-10 has spotted an Iraqi tank hidden under netting designed to hide its infrared hotspot. The shape of the tank is obscured, but the tank tracks around the netting are easy to see. By the end of the war, Iraq had lost over 90% of its tanks, 90% of its artillery, and 50% of its other armored vehicles in the Kuwait theater of operations.
Okay, we got people running.
Gosh, personally, I don't know. I stopped counting. I stopped counting the number of missiles I fired. I stopped counting the bombs I dropped. It's just, as I said, I guess someday in my mind it'll come to me, but I sort of push that off to the corner of my mind. It's you just go from day to day, and you write your letters home, and then you go to sleep and you get up for your next missions.
The problem we faced with the A-10 was the fact that because of its slower air speeds, it was more susceptible to enemy ground fire. With about 10% of our forces, we suffered over half our casualties on the Air Force, United States Air Force side, through the A-10. I think the Marine Corps had a similar problem with the AV-8 because the way the engines are located along the center line of the aircraft, and the heat-seeking missiles would strike the middle of the airplane rather than the tail. So you have to look at each aircraft's design and weigh its strengths and weaknesses to know where to use it in the battle. The A-10s were superb. However, they were more vulnerable to the enemy defenses.
That vulnerability was offset by the A-10's amazing resilience. Pilots flying into anti-aircraft fire were particularly thankful for the titanium bathtub, the super-hard cockpit shell that shields them from flak.
Boy, that Hummer was trying hard to blow you out of the air. Look at that.
Tell me the hog can't take some hits, huh?
I'm telling you. I isolated both hydraulic systems. As soon as I was hit, the right system went to zero, and all the lights in the world came on. Missile went off, and I thought it was the SAM going by, so I started kicking flares after that. And, good show.
During the Gulf War, A-10s attacked a wide range of targets, including tanks, artillery, and bunkers.
Okay, passing 10, I got something revetted.
A-10s worked near, but generally not directly alongside, advancing Army units. Low-level search and destroy missions were handled primarily by the Army's fearsome Apache gunships. The massive assault kept Iraqi ground forces from maneuvering. If they tried, they were pounded by tanks, artillery, and air power.
Roger, we got a whole bunch of guys throwing AK-47s up the air down here. Does that mean anything? Don't shoot them, shoot their equipment.
The air attacks cut enemy soldiers off from food and water. Constant bombing left thousands in shock. Soon, the coalition army found itself overwhelmed by surrendering troops. By the end of the war, more than 86,000 Iraqis were in custody. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of coalition forces, expected the ground phase of the war would last 3 weeks. In fact, it took just 100 hours to recapture Kuwait and neutralize the Iraqi army. The ground forces moved so quickly and the speed of combat was so fast that the coalition attackers mistook some of their own invading army for retreating Iraqi soldiers. At least 11 Americans were killed and 15 wounded from air-to-ground friendly fire.
We had some friendly fire issues, and they are disturbing. There's no doubt about it. We had an A-10 hit a Marine vehicle. I believe we had a Marines rolled in on a Marine column. We had an A-10 hit 2 British vehicles, or 2 A-10s. And we had a number of incidents ground to ground. Now, taken in total, this number is relatively very, very small. It's minute. But the problem is, nowadays, with the lethality of modern airplanes, if you have one incident, it results in 7 or 8 fatalities, where in past wars, such an incident might reflect a damaged vehicle or a wounded person. So we have to work this issue very, very hard.
Roger, the reason I'm asking is need to find out if this is a friendly or not.
Yeah.
Over the course of 43 days, more than 2,600 aircraft flew 110,000 sorties that crushed Iraq's defenses and left its troops battle-weary and anxious to surrender. Laser-guided weapons let us drop fewer bombs for greater effect than in past wars. But it should not be forgotten that the ultimate result of a massive military offensive is massive loss of life. The chief difference between this war and others is that the balance of casualties was wildly uneven. Coalition forces lost roughly 200 soldiers in combat. The Iraqi army lost at least 100,000. The Gulf War is now behind us, but it is certain that the conflict was a turning point in the history of warfare. For the first time, a massive around-the-clock strategic air campaign was directly responsible for a decisive victory over a well-defended enemy. After 80 years, air power fulfilled its deadly potential.